All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of React Roundup. I am TJ Van Tol, and I'm flying solo on the panel today, but that's all right because we are joined by an awesome guest, Shawn Wang, aka Swix. I think I got that right, is joining us today. So, Shawn, why don't you give us a little introduction to yourself, tell us why you're famous, all that good stuff.
Don't know about famous, but so hey everyone, I'm from Singapore and most recently live in New York City working on essentially like web development, JavaScripty, Reacty stuff. Been doing this for a while. I was previously at Netlify and recently joined AWS this year. I also helped to moderate the r/React.js subreddit where we're looking for more moderators. Like literally this morning, I just whipped up a new moderator application. So if you're interested in helping to run a community of over 200,000 React developers. Yep. And yeah, I do a bunch of speaking and writing about React. And I think, most recently I did a What's New in React talk, which is always, it's kind of like easy because like, you just like pull together a bunch of things, but then it's also hard because like what do you put in and how do you organize it? So I did this talk for IonicConf, and I think that's what we're going to talk about today.
Leveling up is important. I spend at least an hour every day learning ways I can improve my business or take a break and listen to a good book. If you're looking to level up, I recommend you start out with the 12-week year as a system to plan out where you want to end up and how to get the results you want. You can get it free by going to audibletrial.com/code. That's audibletrial.com/code.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me because in a sense, like React, and on one hand, like doesn't change much at all, right? Like you can have React code and your code is just going to continue to work. But on the other hand, the React world is so big and so crazy that things change all the time. So like, I guess to maybe kick us off here today, what would you say are like the biggest things? Like what are some of the higher level things that are changing in React today?
Oof. Yeah. So, I just kind of respond to the initial point that you made earlier, which is, React 16, we just celebrated its third birthday last weekend.
That's right.
And so, the major version hasn't changed. And to be honest, like the API hasn't changed since 15. And React 17 is also not going to be changing its API. So it's like React has basically reached the level of like where one of the core features that it ships is API stability. Like nobody's looking for like the hot new thing so much as like, let's just make sure this scales, is production ready as fast as possible. And then let's build on top of it. So that's kind of what we're seeing right now. So the things that are changing, that said, it is not sort of, cold. The main thing that's changing, at least in core React, is concurrent mode, which has been telegraphed for over 2 years, is proving harder than expected. But, it's promising to deliver a paradigm shift in how we write apps with very high perceived performance and just really good user experience all around, with the nice trade-off that is also very easy to write it. So the developer experience is also nice to write. The difficulty is that it seems like React is no longer going to be a server client-side only technology if it's going to achieve that full vision. So what the React core team is working on right now is basically some integration of server-side and client-side. So the future very much looks more like Next.js than it does Create React App. So I think people want to keep up to date on that. They should check out React Flight and React Blocks, which are kind of like the code names for these projects that are going on right now.
Cool. So maybe we could dive into these individually. So concurrent mode is something that, like you said, I feel like it's something that's been perpetually coming soon. So maybe you could tell people just for people that aren't familiar, maybe just give like a very short overview of what concurrent mode is. And I'd actually be curious what you think, like, why isn't it stable at this point, right? Like, because it has been a few years. It is something that I've seen sort of in experimental state. So like, is it bugs? Is it like difficulty of like edge cases? Are you aware?
So, obviously the core team will be best positioned to do that. And all I can do is just stay very close to them just from my interactions with them. The way that I would phrase it, so what is it? It is kind of like it's in the name, it's concurrent rendering. And this is actually something that was envisioned originally by Jordan Walk over 5 years ago. So it's something that's been like theoretical for a while, but it's this idea that you can concurrently render something in the background and kind of like set it up to be rendered, like do all the like the rendering work beforehand and then set it up to be rendered and then swap it out to, when all the data is ready or when all the rendering's done. And that's a bit different from what we do today where everything's kind of like synchronous, like you have to finish rendering the entire tree. And so you can cause jank, especially for much larger apps. And that's definitely what Facebook is seeing. And the definitive demo for people to check this out is Dan Abramov's JSConf Iceland video, where he kind of showed off the two headline features of concurrent mode, which is React Suspense and time slicing. Time slicing you get for free once you opt into concurrent mode. Like the way that you opt into concurrent mode is essentially just swapping your root out. So you used to do React DOM.render. Now you do React.create root. And once you do that, especially when you opt into the unstable concurrent mode, then you opt into the entire tree of React elements being concurrent mode. That means that all of them are rendered using time slicing, which means that you don't no longer sort of block on sort of rendering expensive components, which is just like an automatic improvement in terms of your perceived performance, and that's great. The other part is suspense, which makes it much easier for you to coordinate the reveal of specific screens, and we can go further into that. But I do a lot more of this. I sort of build a React from scratch and then show you how to implement something like a concurrent mode in one of my talks. So the title of that talk is Concurrent React from Scratch. Just Google it up, you'll see it. And then the final point I want to answer is regarding stability. It's experimental because they don't want to commit to a specific API. They're very, very careful about committing to external APIs, because the moment they mark something as released, then they have to support it forever. And people will be very, very pissed if they release something and then go back on it. So that's the kind of care you have to take at the scale of React, where you have 3 to 5 million developers depending on you. But they don't take that level of caution with themselves. So in Facebook.com, the big FB5 rewrite that they just pushed, concurrent mode is in active production use. So it's pretty funny that Facebook gets it and the rest of us don't, simply because our demands are higher than Facebook's.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. And I grabbed the link to your talk too. So if you're listening to this, you can check the show notes to follow up if you want to watch that talk and go into a little more depth on concurrent mode. Yeah, because I see it too, because I work for the company of Progress. We make UI components, and UI components are like a prime example of where you might want this sort of rendering thing, right? Because especially if you're showing a more complex bit of UI, lots of times you can have lots of complex things going on. So we have lots of people asking us all the time when this is coming, and we got to give the same sort of answer of it's complicated and Facebook's kind of using it. And so hopefully we'll reach the point here soon where it's actually the experimental flag is taken off and it's ready for everybody to use.
Yeah, it'll come when it comes. I don't think it's constructive to speculate. I see constantly Q&As at every single React conference that I do. When is it coming? Like, how do we get ready for it? Just write your apps. It's fine. There'll be a migration path. You don't have to be ahead on everything. You can if you want to, and I've done it. It's just not super rewarding if you don't work at Facebook. So don't worry about it.
Well, so speaking of being on top of new features and such, are there any other features that you think are worth highlighting in the later releases of React 16, or even into React 17 is now a thing, right, that people are looking forward to? In those releases, are there things that we all should be aware of, be taking into account for our apps and things like that?
So obviously, let's talk about React 16 first. So part of the talk that I did was kind of rounding up the past year in React minor versions. So that's React 16.9 to 16.13. And these are all anticlimactic versus compared to 16.8, which is the one with hooks. So hooks obviously changed the game, and now they're kind of boring because they haven't changed that much. And 16.9 to 16.13 was a lot about sort of incremental developer experience improvements from testing, like async act, and then they published a testing recipes guide on the React docs. There's a new React profiler component with some interesting sort of profiling capabilities that you might want to call. There's new DX developer experience warnings. There's deprecations of stuff that you shouldn't be using anyway, and then there's more formal sort of release channel organization. So very much like developer experience-y type things to help you develop React apps, but nothing sort of major as hooks. So very much the same thing for React 17, except that because you're bumping a major version, you're allowed to deprecate some things and change the behavior of some other things. So, something that people are pretty excited about, which shows you how really minor this is that the JSX import's going away because Babel is now able to automatically import the new JSX runtime. In practice, that just means that you just remove one line of code from every React file that you have. Not a big deal, but under the hood, it may cause some speed improvements at very big scale, and it may cause some improvement in typings way down the line, which is to say that it's not that big a deal.
Yeah, I think people react to that so like viscerally because we've typed that
There's
line
nothing
of
else.
code so many times, right? Like I feel like
Yeah.
in my sleep, right? I
It's
could
an
suffer
improvement.
some. Yeah, exactly. It's like muscle memory at this point.
No, and look, I've been a React beginner, and I have forgotten that line of code, and then I see that error, and I'm like, what is this like undefined is React is undefined thing? So yeah, I get it. Like you want to make an improvement, it's great. It's just like there's nothing else to talk about. That's why we're making a big deal out of it.
Yeah, and I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing either, right? I mean, it's really a testament to how stable React has become and how widespread it is, and how they really, at this point, it's hard to change anything fundamental to React just because it's got such a widespread usage. You really just can't break existing apps.
Yeah, so which is kind of my thesis. So I wrote a blog post about this called "The Age of React Distros," and that's a phrase that came from James Nelson, who's no longer active on Twitter, but he's someone I look up to on React stuff. Yeah, I think he's been on this podcast actually. But anyway, so yeah, the innovation has gone to building on top of React rather than inside of React itself.
Yeah, and I think some of it too, I'd actually be curious your thoughts on React and the stuff they did in React 17 related to like upgrade paths as well. And if I'm remembering correctly, it's basically React 17 did a lot of internal work to make sort of future proofing React, and also like the ability to run like I believe 2 versions of React on the same page sort of thing as well. Is that like a thing you see like developers realistically actually doing, or is that more of like a niche sort of thing?
Yeah, super niche.
Okay.
Like you probably pretty much have to be like Airbnb or something scale to even care. Most of us should be able to just bump the version and carry on with our lives. And that's the way it should be. But yeah, I also just don't care about it because I'm not at that scale and I don't want to be. So I'm good.
Cool. Well, I know another part of your talk was getting into sort of the surrounding React ecosystem, right? Because not everything that what changes in React is related to core itself. And I know one big thing of that is related to the router and React router and what's going on with there. So do you want to discuss a little bit about what's new with the router, where that space is going as well?
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, routing has never been very competitive. There are basically only 2 routers in the game. There's React Router, and then there's Next.js Router. React Router had a schism the past 2 years. So it split into Reach Router and React Router v5. And then Michael and Ryan got back together again, and now they're working on React Router v6. Still not released. It is probably going to so there's some API changes which people are very pissy about because it's very similar to, it's not as bad as React Router v4, but it is still some churn in API, which is kind of regrettable, but reflects their best opinions at this time. And partially, I think the main feature is that they're supporting nested routing much more, which React Router v4 and Reach Router were kind of more, you had to specify the entire path, whereas here you can actually you actually have route composition, which they love. And then the other thing is obviously because they're all in on hooks, they're able to drop support and the size decreased from 20 kilobytes to 8 kilobytes. So that's a lot. That's a pure win. The main realization about routing actually is that a lot of it has to do with like how it interacts with the cache, especially for statically generated sites, but then also I think just like there's just a general realization that routers should come with some sort of cache. And that's what Michael and Ryan are building into Remix, which is the new sort of React meta framework that they have yet to release, but it will basically be released concurrently with React Router v6. And so like React Router v6 will be kind of just be like the client side version, and then Remix will be kind of that plus the server side infrastructure that you need to achieve their sort of full stack vision. So that's interesting. And then obviously on Next.js side of things, not much changing over there. Just the hooks version is out, so that's what's going on there.
So a couple questions related to that. So React Router v6, so currently that's sort of like in a beta state, correct? Like that's not a live thing.
Yeah, it's been for a while. I'm not sure what the game plan is. I haven't stuck too close yet, but it's been like in beta for a while. Yeah, for basically the entire calendar year of 2020. So like I suspect basically it will just release whenever Remix is released, and it will just be like the free client version, whereas the Remix will be paid and sort of full stacky version. And obviously they're being developed together because it's very tightly integrated with the full stack framework.
Yeah, when you say caching too, that's sort of intriguing. Is that like caching at the browser level, or is it some sort of like internal cache to the router that it's caching different,
Yeah, router
say, like
cache.
renderings of components and such, more or
Yeah.
less?
Yeah. You have to basically replicate a bunch of things that the browser does for you by default, in the hopes of wins in terms of speed, in terms of user experience, in terms of like the ability to manipulate data programmatically through APIs that the browser just doesn't give you. And I mean, I think obviously this is a little bit contentious, especially among the no frameworks crowd, but have faith. Like these guys have been doing it for a while.
Yeah, it's one of those things that like instantly in my head, I think of both the benefits and also the problems, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like anything else. It's like, oh man, like your
trust
first reaction.
Trust them to know. Trust them, like they've been yelled at more than anyone. So trust them to know about this.
Well, caching is notoriously one of the 3 hardest problems in computer science. So
sure. Yeah. So I mean, like there's this, and then there's like essentially all the other sort of caching. Like React Suspense is essentially basically saying that all basically every solution or every app that uses React Suspense needs to have a cache, which is why you see libraries like React Query come out where there's like an inbuilt caching system. And we all basically just have to get smarter about caching solutions. Next.js itself is also, has opinionated caching layer, especially to do with data, with SWR, which is their stay while revalidate fetching library. And so like, yeah, I mean, this will come to all parts of our stack. And I think we just got to deal with it,
Yep, for sure. Yeah, because I mean, there's some real gains to be had in terms of performance. I mean, especially if your app is large and React is increasingly used in the biggest of the big apps out there, like any little edge you can gain in terms of rendering performance is oftentimes worth your engineering time and effort. So if frameworks there make it easier, then great.
Yep.
I am curious too that this is probably a minor note. You mentioned API changes with the router as well. And the thing that caught my eye with probably everybody else's switch is becoming routes, which like is like the tiniest of changes, right? But like it makes you wonder, like why bother doing that? It's like, okay, like routes is arguably a better name, but it's like switch is not a bad name.
Switch has that sort of semantic meaning of like, we'll only pick one of these, whereas routes, like you could pick multiple. So, like because of JavaScript switch, you literally only match one.
Yeah.
So I think that makes sense to me. But to be honest, like I don't try to second guess their decision just because I wasn't there. So I would just report on what they decide ultimately, because I'm not the maintainer, right? So I'm just not. I don't have time to waste on like second guessing decisions.
Is there a situation though where you'd want to pick more than one route? Like I'm trying to think of like a use case where you'd want to match on multiple routes, and that sort of.
It's more like a fallback situation if like something doesn't match. Like Reach Router had this like kind of complicated, kind of magical. They're like, just trust us, we'll get it right situation with multiple matching. And I don't know, like it was a lot of faith to put in like this black box algorithm. So I think switch is just a little bit simpler. Like we all get a switch. We've written switches. So having that for routing kind of makes sense.
And I think my last question about routing is, do you have any guidance on, because I've personally been, I use the React router and I've like sort of never had a need for anything else. So I've never even looked into the next router. Do you have like a short recommendation on like what the routers do different, or like what are some situations where you might want to look into the next router? Is it just provide a little bit more on top, or I'm genuinely curious what the differences even are.
As far as I know, it's more like a instruction to Next.js. So it has to degrade nicely for server-side rendering is the main idea. Like it has to fall nicely back to just Ahref. But then also if it's hydrated, then it has to switch to client-side routing. That's why you have to use their link tags and their specific router. They probably also do some prefetching, which is very nice, kind of built in, which is every meta framework like Gatsby also tries to do that. Like so just for people who don't know, like prefetching is kind of like when you hover over a link and you hover for like 200 milliseconds, you're probably going to click it. So they can just start loading that data right away before you click it, so that once you've actually moused up, the data is already there. You just have an instant navigation away. So very, very minor details that make the experience a lot faster.
Cool. Yeah, it's on my list of like, I think every developer has some sort of like list of things that they need to check out at some point. So it's been on my list. So I'll have to get around to it at some point. And so the next thing I want to get into, because this is another bit that fascinates me as well, is like DevTools and build tools changes with React, because that's a bit of React that's always been a little bit of a black box to me. Like I typically use create React app and like magic happens and my app comes out and things are great. So I'm curious like what the state of that is today, what's been changing in that space and whatnot as well.
Yeah. So all the major build tools basically put out a new version this year. So there's Webpack v5, Rollup v2, Parcel v2. Parcel I think is not yet live, and Rollup is also not yet super live. But the main idea is that they're all sort of working on incremental new changes, like nothing huge. Although Parcel is like a very, very major expansion of their API, which is pretty interesting. Webpack, there's a small community of people that are extremely excited. Like this is the biggest freaking deal in the entire world, which is Module Federation, which helps you do micro front ends. And then obviously there's a bunch of very vocal people who could not care less about micro front ends. But if you care about it, it's there. I think probably the more interesting thing is the overall shift from CommonJS to ES modules. Because once you shift towards ES modules, you leave behind a lot of prior assumptions. And that's where you get like the next generation of build tools, which I'm also pretty interested in. So the next generation tools are things like ES Build, SWC, Roam, Deno, Snowpack, Vite, Sandpack. So those are kind of like next generation in the sense that they're not as old as, as the other three. And even Parcel's not that old, right? It was released in 2018. So it's not that old. It's just like of a different generation. And so the experiments that people are trying out in these aspects, like ES Build is built in Go, SWC is built in Rust. Like if we had a different core systems language in the core of our build tools, people are seeing like 70 to 100 times faster builds, and that actually starts to add up, right? So the old argument was that all our tools have to be built in JavaScript so that JavaScript developers can contribute to them. Guess what? Like people don't actually contribute to build tools that much. So like if we give up that core assumption of like everything has to be in JavaScript for JavaScript, and we build and we use specific languages that are for our hot paths, especially like where speed is actually important. How much faster can we build it? And I think the next generation of tools are doing that, are exploring that. And then the other assumption that I alluded to earlier was ES modules. Like when we like edit a file, why do we have to recompile the entire app in order to reload? Why don't we just serve the new file to our dev environment? And that's what Snowpack and Vite are working on as well.
So I'd be curious. I think the one thing about this space that's like, I mean, we just mentioned like 12 tools, right? It's a very confusing space for developers. So I'd be curious, like if you had to provide like a simplified view for developers, like I guess I'd be curious, like if you're not using like create React app and things aren't like totally automated for you, what's the most, would you say, like common tool chain that people are using today? And then where do you see that's like if you had to pick like some of these ES module tools, which do you see being like the most common maybe, or the most like on the rise that people might be using a year or two from now?
Yeah, for sure. Like definitely don't feel like FOMO, like something like 93% of React apps. So I did a survey of the React subreddit. Something like 93% of React apps are powered by Webpack still today.
Okay. Yep.
So if you don't use Create React app, you probably use either Next.js or Gatsby, or you hand roll a Webpack. So I definitely say like if you don't use Create React app, you should probably be using Next.js. I think that's probably the gold standard right now. I think Parcel is very, very good for zero config support of React. Rollup can support React. It's just not first class, and you have to figure out some small config issues, which is probably more trouble than it's worth. And the other thing I'd also recommend people check out is Vite. Vite is kind of comparable to Parcel, but some kind of that newer generation. So when we're talking about newer generation stuff, we're really talking about like 1% to 2% of apps, right? Like that's how niche, that's how fringe this is right now. Like maybe check back in 5 years, maybe these things will be more significant. But you have to have this frontier of innovation, right? So and then I think the reason you go after the next generation apps, the next generation builders, is you want more speed, and the current generation of tools are just like too slow for you in terms of build speed and in terms of dev sort of hot reloading, hot refreshing time. And yeah, like it's very promising because like these things seem to work. Like I've played around with a bunch of these tools, ES Build in particular. So ES Build was like a side project of like the Cloudflare CTO, and it seems to be picking up in a bunch of different as like an underlying tool and a bunch of different other ecosystem tooling. So like Vite uses ES Build under the hood, and ES Build, for those who don't know, is kind of like the webpack but built in Go, and it's 100 times faster by their own benchmarks. And so like I think the future is kind of polyglot in terms of these like core underlying tools, because we've kind of reached the boundary of like how fast things built in JavaScript can be. And in order to break that boundary, we have to explore some other, pretty radical approaches.
Have you ever wondered if you could be offering a faster, less buggy experience for your customers? I mean, let's face it, the only way you're going to know that is by actually running it on production. So go figure it out, right? You run it on production, but you need something plugged in so that you can find out where those issues are, where it's slowing down, where it's having bugs. You need something like that there. And Raygun is awesome at this. They just added the performance monitoring, which is really slick, and it works like a breeze. I love it. I love it. It's like you get the ray gun and you zap the bugs. Anyway, definitely go check it out. It's going to save you a ton of time, a ton of money, a ton of sanity. I mean, let's face it, grepping through logs is no fun, and having people not able to tell you that it's too slow because they got sidetracked into Twitter is also not fun. So go check out Raygun. They are definitely going to help you out. There are thousands of customer-centric, customer-focused software companies who use Raygun every day to deliver great experiences for their customers. And if you go to Raygun and you use our link, you can get a 14-day free trial. So you can go check that out at reactroundup.com/Raygun.
Yeah. First of all, note for anybody that also didn't know, like me, Vite is VITE. And I tossed a link in the show notes as well, because that was a new term for me. And I did like the bit you said too about just not letting like FOMO take over here, because I think most React devs, like on a day-to-day basis, I'm certainly in that 93%, right? I have some automated webpack that I didn't work on.
Yeah, you got other problems to solve. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like, I feel like if you're the type of person that really needs to optimize your apps, this is probably the time to start playing around with these tools. Like you said, if this is an actual need for you, if you need, maybe you're working at a large organization and speeding up your build times and such actually can provide some big value to your org, then great, like start to dig into these. But I'd also say that if not, you probably can wait off a little bit, at least in my opinion, to just like see which of these sort of win out, because there's probably going to be a little bit of consolidation in terms of which of these tools prove to be the most useful for more people. And then more tutorials and courses from people like you will come out to help people when it becomes more time to actually start to implement these in your more like rank and file React apps.
Well, so, I definitely say this is the time to already start being aware of what these things promise, because sometimes you don't know what you want until you kind of see it and take a look at it for yourself. And like I'll just ask you, like, how many times a day do you save files? Do you edit and save files? Like, let's say
quite a few,
a few hundred times, right?
Yeah.
And each of the, like, let's say each of them, like, let's say you have like a slow sort of rebuild or hot refresh process, and that and that's like 2 seconds each that you could shave off by using a much faster tool. That's probably like 400 seconds a day, and then just multiply that by however long you're working on your app. Like that just kind of adds up just in terms of raw seconds, but then also your flow and your productivity. Like sometimes I'll just like kind of lose focus and lose attention if I'm just waiting too long for a rebuild. So like it's kind of like every order of magnitude improvement in tools unlocks something else, something unexpected in terms of your productivity. So that's why people are so interested in this stuff.
Awesome. So I think next on our list of sort of newish React sort of pillars of things to talk about is a pretty small topic. So we got state management that's next on your list.
I should also sort of give a shout out, before we leave like the whole build tools thing altogether. MDX has basically won out in terms of documentation authoring in React. And then TypeScript has also won out. So, I have this list of like how many projects have rewritten, not just like exported TypeScript types, but like rewritten their entire core code base in TypeScript. And so like TypeScript has definitely won, in terms of React. And I used to track the numbers, but like it's not even funny anymore. It's like something like 60 to 70% of the ecosystem. So you don't have to learn TypeScript to use React. but it would help you.
Yeah, I've actually switched to using TypeScript. I've been a TypeScript fan for quite a while, but for a while I held off on React just because it was a little tricky. Like I ran into some weird like odds and ends online, and I found more recently, I'd say within the last 6 months to a year, like if I run into a TypeScript problem and I Google it, I find the answer, right? It's become popular enough now that like it's people like sort of assume that workflow is out there and accommodate for it. And you almost never run into a tool anymore that doesn't provide like a really good TypeScript experience. So I'd plus one that.
So that's something I'm working a lot on. So, I started the React and TypeScript cheat sheets 2 years ago, and I've been sort of curating all these answers and basically accumulating like the ultimate copy and paste repo for everyone. And so, yeah, it's still work in progress, but like, yeah, I definitely agree with you. Like it's the hard work of a lot of people just kind of figuring this out.
Oh man, I didn't realize you were the person behind this. When I spoke of like Google searches to find things, I've totally ended up here before.
We've got pretty good SEO. Dude, like I teach 1,000 people a day React and TypeScript. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm sure you've solved more than one random compiler issue I've ran into at some point. So very much appreciated.
But yeah, the work is definitely not done. Like I need more contributors and more people just opening issues. Like I'm sure it's not as good as it could be.
Yep, and I put a link.
Always welcome.
Yep, and I put a link to the cheat sheets in. So if you want to check those out or contribute or whatever, and you're listening to this, that's the place to check it out. All right, so I do want to get into state management as well. A nice light one, right? Not much complexity going on here. So do you want to provide like an overview, kind of like we did with tools of like where state management is with React today and maybe where it's heading?
Yeah, so this one, the survey that I did also comes in super handy. And where people are at is that it's about a third between no state management library, so just pure React,